All right, so I've opened a scene that just has plants as well as grass in it now, and so that we can start moving on to talking about grass shading. And it's basically the same as what we have with everything else. So in this scene, we have our, if we look over into the outliner, there are plants, there are trees in here that I've hidden because we haven't gotten to that yet. But all of the plants that we've seen already. And then as far as the grasses go, basically it's all of the stuff that we have here on the ground, so the different types of strokes, the field grass, as well as this cactus grass, which is back here. And so the shaders that are on these things, if I go and grab, let's close this for a second, go and grab, let's say, the cactus grass, and let's open Hypershade. So we can see inside here that for the cactus grass, and let me just minimize this a little bit, that obviously we have, the branches. And so I have just a generic sort of wood texture on there going into an MIA material. We have the leaves, which if we graph that, we can see have a very simple shader. It's just a solid color ramp, but this, if we look inside here, is going into translucency. For this scene, this should actually probably be gamma corrected, but which means it's going to look a little bright in the render, so brighter than maybe intended, but it actually looks kind of cool. And then for the flowers of it, I have a similar shader. So this is something that I made the shader before I added the physical sun and sky, which is why it's not gamma corrected. So really in the end, if I did gamma correct it, it would just get a little bit darker. But you can see that the cactus grass, has a cool look to it. But specifically as far as the ground grass, what we're going to do to discuss it is, just sort of create a scene from scratch. But if I grab the grass and graph that, what we'll see is that it's our generic setup, MIA material. I'm using a file texture that's being gamma corrected and being used as both the diffuse color as well as the translucency color. And so in here with the grass as it is, as far as this file texture goes, this is a very simple file texture that I actually found online just by Google searching, but it'd be a very easy thing to create yourself. And so if I go into Photoshop, and here I just have that same scene rendered from a different angle, but let me just go and close that out and open the grass shader, or rather grass texture. That's in my source images directory, and it's this guy. So a blade of grass. And so for this, in the end, as opposed to not using a texture, you'll find that it's going to look a lot better just because it creates a little bit of a breakup in color in your grass blades. And so if you go ahead and just sort of Google grass texture, you'll probably end up finding this one because that's how I did. But as you can see, it'd be an incredibly easy texture to create from scratch. And so with that said, going back into Maya, with the render that we're doing right now, it's this is a little simplistic and not really the best thing to evaluate the shader from this distance. And so we want to sort of get the grass rendered so that it looks good from different lighting conditions, and also up close, if in case it's close to camera, if you had the camera close to the ground, for example. And then we'll move on to how to populate a scene with grass. So yeah. So I'm going to go and make a new scene. And in here with the grid, I'm going to create a ground plane. So we've got that. And for the ground plane, I'll go and give it a shader. So I'm going to give it a MIA material. And let me set up my render settings that I'm going to need. So I'm going to need mental ray. And then under quality, I'll just set it to 1. I'm going to go to Mitchell so that the render is a little bit sharper. It takes a little longer to render, but for what we're going to do, it's not a big deal. But it gives you a very sharp in focus render. Under ray tracing, I'm going to up my refractions and max trace depth, basically because we're using translucency, and that's something that's going to be important. And then under indirect lighting, I'm going to create physical sun and sky, which automatically turns on final gather. So just the basic scene setup that we've done before. So there's my sun node. And then I'm going to go to my camera, select it. I'm going to go to the connection editor. I'm also going to open Hypershade. I'm going to go and create a physical, or rather a photographic exposure node. That's going to plop in here. I can see what it's connected to. So I'll disconnect those. And then for the new one, drag it onto the camera as default. Drag it onto the physical sky. And for that, I'm going to go to Other, choose Message. So again, make sure that this Show Hidden is checked on both the left and right. And Message gets connected to MI Sky Exposure. And now I can delete that. And then on your physical sky, remember when you switch to the photographic node, you need to change the unit conversion to 0.318. And then finally on my exposure photographic node, your render will probably end up coming out a little dark unless you lower the f-stop. Granted, you could also change the ISO or the shutter, but as if I'm using a normal camera, I'll just lower the f-stop, which is like making the aperture of the camera larger so it lets in more light. So I'm going to lower that, let's say, to 9 for now. And yeah, so just basic settings for getting our render set up. And then for the size we'll render at, we'll do 720p. So HD 720. And I'll turn on my resolution gate inside here so we can see what's going to render. And for the resolution gate, I'm going to go under Display on my camera node and just adjust the overscan so it's just less wasted space out there. Okay, so this is my basic scene setup. So my project, kit of parts, and let's save this out as, let's say, tutorial grass shader 01. All right. So, and then let me just get my sun out of the way a little bit. So as far as going and creating the grass, the first thing is in general, when I'm creating these kind of assets, I tend to be trying to work more in real-world scale these days. It tends to give you more realistic results when you get into using trying to do physical-based lighting. And so with that, you know, if I went and created a cube and decided, okay, well that's 1 centimeter, default units in Maya. How tall is a blade of grass? Well, obviously it's relatively, you know, short. It could be as short as, you know, 2 centimeters or 3 centimeters. There is taller grass than that, but, you know, if I put this to, you know, 3 centimeter tall grass, you know, this just gives me a reference point when I draw my paint effect stroke to the height that I want. And so what we're going to do inside here now is go to Visor. And then inside here, I'm going to get this funky thing again, so let me just go and open Visor this way. Go to Grass. And then we have, you know, our different types of grass. And as we know now, it's very easy to adjust the settings as far as the bend and all that. So it really doesn't matter which one we choose to use. And so, but if I go and draw a stroke, we can see it's a little short. And so I'm going to adjust the settings there. And so I'm going to go to template brush settings and increase the scale so that we're getting grass that's roughly the height of my cube. So you can see that pretty much does it. And then for the template brush settings, if I go inside here and I go to tubes, and then I look around here, we know that if I want to adjust the grass so that it goes to a tip and we don't have those blunt ends, we want to adjust the width scale. And so remember, you have width scale in different places. Well, actually, no. For the branches, it's going to be this width scale here. So I'll just go and adjust my template brush so that now, actually, let me just undo a couple steps. Right. We can see that our grass is going to a point, like so. So that's what I want. And what we're going to create in here is just a simple patch of grass like this. And so we don't really actually need much more than what I've just created. But let's just go in and make a stroke that's a little longer. Close this out. Okay. And then looking at the grass, obviously we could go in and make some adjustments if we think it's bending too much. And so if I go in here, as we know that we have our behavior, and so we have gravity and path follow, and then under creation we also have our tube direction. So I could go and adjust, the tube direction on these, so maybe they're a little bit more upright, but I'll keep the bend that's in them. And then maybe I want this to be a little bit denser. And so for that, we'll see that we have tubes per step. So I can raise that up. So we have thicker grass in here. I'm going to put that to 60. Or maybe let's lower that to 50. All right. So this gives us a basic start point. And so now I don't really need that cube anymore. Just get rid of it. And our next step is going to be to convert this to polys. So I'm going to go to Mesh inside here. And I want to go to Mesh Output, Output Quads, and then convert Paint Effects to Polygons, Quad Output, Convert. And so I'll leave the stroke in here just if we want to draw more grass. We now have that as a reference point or something that we can get by going to Paint Effects, Get Settings from Stroke if we want to draw more that looks like this. But now we have our geometry. And so now we're ready to make the shader. And so I'm just going to save again. And for the shader we're going to create, let's go to Hypershade. And if I select this and graph it, or select the geometry and graph it, the shader that we get, as we've been talking about, we don't want. So we're going to create a MIA Material X, which we will assign to the grass. So if I now delete unused nodes, I'm just going to get rid of that one, which is fine. And also I think I never assigned a shader to the ground like I meant to, so let me just do that. So I'm going to use one of these for the ground, and for that I'm just going to lower the glossiness down on it. And I'll also turn on ambient occlusion for the ground. And so I'm just going to call this my ground MIA. And this one I'll call my grass MIA. And if I select objects with material, assign. All right, so that's on the ground, that's on the grass. So for the grass, the changes that we're going to want to make, as we know, the first thing, these have no thickness, so I know that under advanced reflection I have to turn off skip reflection on inside. So both sides of each blade of grass are reflective. Under refraction, we know we have to make it thin-walled since they have no thickness. We know we're going to want to use transparency to create translucency, so we'll start with a value of 0.25. Under translucency, we're going to want to turn it on with a weight of 1, so they're not transparent, they're opaque, yet translucent. Under reflectivity and glossiness, I'll put the reflectivity to 1, and I'll start with a glossiness of 0.3. So this is just controlling the blur of the reflection, which in the end you could think of as the size of the specular highlight. And then under BRDF, we can see that our reflectivity is at 1, but we're actually getting these settings. Facing the camera is 0.2, turning away from the camera is 1. And you can leave it at that for now. And so now what we need is a texture for diffuse color as well as the translucency color. And so, like I showed earlier, it's beneficial to use a file texture. So I'm going to go in here and map the diffuse color using a file texture. Lower the blur down on the file texture. I'm going to grab that grass texture. So now that's on there. So if I now go into Hypershade and graph the network, we've got that. But since we're using physical sun and sky, we know that we're going to need to gamma correct this texture. And for using it as translucency, we also we're going to need to multiply it. All right. So right now, since I have my transparency set to 0.25, we know the multiply divide node will be set to multiply at 4. And we also know what the gamma correct node needs. So 0.454. The multiply node is going to be 444. So my file texture is going to output into the gamma correct node value. I'm going to disconnect the connections between the file texture and the MIA. And then I'll connect the gamma correct node to diffuse. So there we go. And then I'll take the gamma corrected version of the file texture, put that into the multiply divide node. So that's input 1, and then input 2 is manually entered with 4. And then on my MIA, I want to go to the refraction color, which is right there, and grab the multiply divide node. Graph it, and there's your network. So we've blocked out our settings. We can see that once you've done this a few times, it goes really, really fast. And so we've got color mapped with a file texture. We've got a weight value of 1 for the diffuse. We don't have any roughness because grass is relatively smooth. We've got reflectivity of 1 because we're relying on the BRDF curve. Glossiness at 0.3. Importantly, skip reflection on inside is off. Transparency is set to 0.25 for the translucency. Thin-walled. BRDF curve, leaving it as default for now. Translucency on. The file texture pumping through gamma and a multiply divide node going into the color and the weight value at 1. And then I'll turn on ambient occlusion just to improve the shading that we get in our render. So, and that is assigned. So if I select objects with material, it's assigned to my grass. And now we can do a render. And so we can just go in here and, let's say, pick any camera view. We could choose to make the ground plane a little bigger. And I'm going to grab my light and just get it out of the way so we can see it. And then I'm going to do a couple renders just with the light coming in at different angles. So first let me save my scene. And then I'll launch these renders. And also inside here, just to improve the quality of the render before I do it, under indirect lighting, Final Gather was turned on when I created the physical sun and sky. But going into the Final Gather settings, I'm going to set the filter to 1. So that just helps reduce artifacts if you do larger renders. That's my experience with it. I'm going to increase the reflection, refraction, and trace depth settings just a little bit. And then I'm going to add one secondary bounce, which is going to help the quality of the rendering with bounce light via Final Gather. So the only thing that I am aware of is that what I've put on the ground here is going to be really, really bright. And so this ground MIA, because its color is not gamma corrected, so it's going to be brighter than a mid-value gray. So that's going to create a lot of bounce light coming up onto the grass. And so inside here, maybe I'll go in and just darken it down a little bit. So I could go and put some dirt texture or grass texture or something on there, but for now we'll just leave it alone. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple renders. So open up the render view window. And we are using just the regular Persp Cam. So let's go and check it out and see what we've got. And this shouldn't necessarily take that long to render, since it is a very, very simple scene. But there is a lot of geometry with the grass. So I'm just going to pause, and we'll be back and look at some renders. All right, so I've done a few renders, and so we can see that the grass is looking pretty good. So we have the sunlight coming in from an angle just so that we can see not just the translucency, but also the specularity or the reflectivity of the grass. And so with the settings that we used, just sort of off the bat, everything pretty much looks pretty good. It's a case where looking at a clump of grass by itself in the scene, you wouldn't necessarily, need to tune it. It's sort of once you get the grass into, sort of an environment that you might want to adjust the reflectivity or the translucency to match the look you're going for. So right now, this is really the basics of a grass shader. But if I look at some of these different renders, we're looking at it just with, the light coming in from the side a little bit rear, this one a little bit more frontal. So again, we're seeing that the reflectivity is creating a pretty bright highlight on them. And this is something, though, that you will see if you Google photographs of grass, is that the specular highlights, or the parts that are reflecting the sun due to exposure, actually do get quite bright and actually can go all the way to white. And so, again, this is something that actually is relatively accurate. Going through the next render, what I chose to do is just bring the camera a little bit closer. And it's looking cool, but what you will notice if you want to get this close to grass, which isn't necessarily going to happen that often, is this is where a bump map would potentially be useful. And so in the next render, you can see the only difference here really is I just put a very, very slight bump on the grass. So if you look at these individual blades, so here when we're this close, the highlight's just so smooth, it sort of gives away the fact that it's just a simple poly. But a little bit of breakup in the spec is going to be really useful. And so the bump that I have in there is just procedural. So if I go and open Hypershade, and we take a look at our grass shader, you can see this is what I put on bump. So it's a relatively low intensity bump. So it's, at 0.25. And then this ramp is a very, very simple ramp. By default, they're a V ramp. So I had to switch it to U, so it's in the correct orientation with the UVs. I switched it to smooth, and so by default it's linear. So you can see you get this little peak right there. So smooth is a nice way to round that out. And then I'm repeating it, and that's being done over here on the placement node. So you can see I put the repeats to 4, which is what's making the ramp look like this. So if we take a look at the render, you can see very, very simple. And, looking again at up close photos of grass, the bump that you get on grass is pretty much something very similar to this. There can be a little bit of variation from blade to blade, but doing it procedurally in this manner is relatively straightforward. So if I sort of go through here, we have just different lighting. And so same exact shader with that bump map, so we can see the breakup that it's giving, and that our grass has, a nice look to it. And then the next renders, what I did is I actually just swapped the texture out with something different. And so these are actually coming from scans that I did of individual leaves. And not specifically grass. I just, went outside and scanned a few different blades from a plant that has very long, thin blades just like this. So it's, because of that, the texture's feeling a little less like grass, although from far away, it would end up looking pretty cool. If I go to, let's say, the next one, you can sort of see the variation that I'm getting. So all of these are coming from these different scans. And so now they all have the exact same texture because we haven't done something to try and break it up. But real quick, I'm just going to go to Photoshop just so you can see what textures I'm using. And we're in the folder already. So if I go to the scans that I did, let me locate those real quick. All right, just quickly move them into this directory. And these are some simple scans. And so let me just get these to be separated. And so I just went and grabbed some of these blades that have, something that's pretty much akin to a grass type texture, even though these are much longer than a blade of grass. These are about, 8 inches, 9 inches long. So these are coming from a plant. But I just grabbed one that you can see has different, let's just zoom in, levels of browning at the tips. And so with these, it was then just a matter of getting them ready to be used as a texture. And so since we know that the UVs on the grass from the paint effect stroke are pretty much filling the entire 0 to 1 area, I just needed to go in and take these and sort of stretch them out to fill, as we're seeing. And so if I look at something like this blade of grass, once you horizontally stretch those scans, obviously they're going to look a little blurry. I only did that just so they became square, so that they would match the UVs. And then once mapped, they get shrunk back and it looks good. So the texture I have open right now is this one. And so you can see that if I, we look at that render and we can see it has this little brown tip at the end. And we go to Photoshop and we see this here. It is the same texture. So now this is something that you can see I did it for 5 different blades of grass. But this is something that's also useful for a plant. So I did go and also make a tile sheet of it. So this is just a 3x3, so there would be 3 different types. And so this is something that it's, something initially used for grass, but to create the variety, we can go in and use a script. We're just going to have to point out an issue with the way the grass is created before we can go in and apply something like this to our grass. Just something about the paint effect strokes. But another thing to point out, just so you know what I'm talking about when I say I'm stretching them, is that for something like this, if I just go and quickly, let's say, focus in on just this one leaf right here. Let's just go to normal. And let's go and crop the image. So all I'm talking about with filling them out is if I put it on a new layer, obviously just going and trying to get this thing to be straight. And the easiest thing to do, which is what I used, is just use the warp tool in Photoshop, because then you can easily just sort of nudge this thing so that it's, relatively straight, like so. And then I can go and take this thing and just, stretch it out. And getting it to just fill the entire canvas, and then eventually, after that's done, I can go in. I'm just hitting Control T to get the transform tool. And then, let's say we go and grab that and go to the warp tool. It's just a matter of getting this stuff to be warped. You could also use the liquify brush as well, obviously. So I'm kind of going in and warping it, getting it to fill once you get to the top. You're going to obviously stretch it out a lot, but since your geometry is also going to narrow down to a point, it's less of a problem. So I can then go and just grab that region and then hit Control H to hide the selection. Go to the warp tool, hit Control H just to hide it, even though the warp tool is still active. And you can see basically it's filled out. So the liquify tool could be used to straighten out some of these lines, but it doesn't really matter if they're perfectly straight. It still looks good when applied. But the liquify tool, let me just go in here and flatten this image first, and then I'll put it back on a layer. If I go to liquify and shrink this down a little bit so you can see the whole thing. Liquify is nice just because you can really go in and nudge some of these pixels around. So let's get that. And then change the brush size to make little adjustments. So very, very simple. So that once that's flattened and stretched out to fill, then I can always image size it to make it square. So in here, if I made this 1024 by 1024 for a 1K texture, we get that. And so that's ready to fill the 0 to 1 on the texture for something like a grass blade. And then aside from grass, this texture I'm using obviously can be used for a variety of long-stemmed plants. So yeah, that's that. So what I want to talk about next, now that we can see that, okay, we've got our grass brush, we've talked about how to get things to a point, how to adjust the angle that it falls, whether it follows the curve and some of the behavior settings, a little bit of a bump. What do we want to do next? So, well, if you did want to, get a little bit of variety in here, because clearly when we look at our grass from a distance, looking at these two renders, all of the grass blades are, very, very uniform in their color. So just like we did with plants, you're going to want to create a little bit of variety to make it look a little more natural. And then also an important thing with grass is that, when you look at a field of grass, you have the new grass, which is standing up tall and, growing up to a point. But you're also going to have the older ground cover, or the older grass is going to be laying a little bit lower and not necessarily pointing up so much. So grass is sort of a combination of a greener grass that grows up high with a browner sort of dead, drier grass that's in the lower underbrush. And so that's one thing that can help make grass look a little bit more dynamic. And then to change the texture, across the blades. So now the reason I said that there's an issue with that is because the script that we were using that allows us to put things into a 2x2 or a 3x3 expects something that we don't have going on in here. And specifically, if I select my grass, based on the way this preset is set up, all of the individual blades have a different length to them. And so what that means is the poly count is not the same. And if you remember, the way we used the script was to, first you would select the geometry, you would separate it, you would combine it, and then you would go and select, a single leaf. And let's say we select this one, it's got one face, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 faces. And the reason you did that was so the script would know how many faces every single blade of grass has. And the reason this doesn't work, or that script doesn't work with this grass that we have, is that all of the blades of grass don't have the same poly count. So this one we can see has that number, but if I grab this guy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 12. This one has 12 faces. Grab this one. 1. This one has 9. So since they're all different, that script won't work for you. So you have to come up with another solution. So you would write a script that doesn't force you to have every single leaf have the same. Maybe there's a script out there, and probably is, that already does that, so that would be the ideal. I don't have that, or haven't found one. If you know of one, email me. That would be awesome. But if you need to come up with an alternate solution, what you'd really want to do is, if you made all of the blades of grass the same length, then they would all have the same poly count. And so what that means is, to get variety of length inside here, what we could do is just draw maybe 3 or 4 strokes. So we have one stroke that's longer blades, another stroke that's a little shorter, and so forth. And that would be a way that you could go and execute that script. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, if I take our mesh that we have here, and let's say this scene we've been working on, I'm going to save it. So this is our save 01 for this tutorial. So now we're going to move on to 02. So I'm going to save my scene again, and let's call this 02. So we're going to end up having to get rid of this grass and go back to our stroke. So let's delete that. And if I go to the stroke in here, since I had construction history off, if I make it visible, it's still not going to pop up. So what we're going to want to do is just draw a new one. So I'm going to select that stroke, meaning the construction history means if I go in here and say make visible, it won't pop on. But I can just go and select it, Paint Effects, get settings from selected stroke, and then go to the Paint Effects tool. And now I can go and draw some grass in here. And it's going to be exactly the same. So if we draw some, we want to identify what is causing each leaf to have a different number of polys. And so that's going to require us to just go to the attribute editor and go to the brush. And with the brush inside here, under creation, you'll see segments is set to 9. And so if I go and I put segments to 1, you'll see that they're not all 1. It reduced it, but it didn't go in and get them to all be one segment. And so now some of them are 1, as we can see, some of these straight line ones right here, and yet some of them in here are 2. So the segments is adjusting the number of segments based on length. So, and then you'll see that there's length min and length max. So since there's a variety of lengths in here, from short to long, that's what's causing them to have a different number of faces per grass blade. So if I put the length min 2.5, they're all now the same length inside. And so this is going to be, in the end, an option for us. So if we now say, okay, well, this is now long grass, but if we decide, well, we're going to have 4 different lengths, then this is a little dense for our grass. So we maybe would want to cut the density of the grass down a bit. So sample density is at 1. I could put it to 0.25 just to reduce the number of grass blades we're getting at this length. So I could do 4 strokes, each with this sample density, but each with a different length. So 0.5 is our longest grass blade. And right, so if we now take a look inside here at these blades, let's convert this to poly. So I'm going to go here and under mesh output, output quads, modify convert, paint effects to polygons, quad output, convert. Okay, we get that. And then for the converted polys, I can go in and this is now hidden. This is going to need to be separated and combined, but also just to check the poly count on these leaves. Let's go to face. Let's get a little closer. Select one. Shift angle bracket. We can see that one has 15. Grab that one. And that one has 15. Grab that one. That one has 15. So as we're going in here and selecting, we're finding, ideally, that they all have 15. That one has 15. So we should be good with our script. So let's take this guy and let's separate it and combine it. So edit mesh, or rather mesh, separate, and then mesh combine. And then now we need to select a single blade. Let's go to our script. And for this, we're going to do a 3x3. And so this is just going to give us a little bit more variety. And hit process. Okay, so that's done. And so what you want to look for inside here with your grass is that each one is a solid color, which means the script worked. If you look at one and half of it's purple and half of it's yellow, it means the UVs didn't get correctly created, which means all of the polys are not the same, or blades of grass are not the same number of polys. So since that worked, then clearly you're going to want to go in and check what the UVs look like. So I'm going to go to the UV texture editor. And they look perfect. And so it is organized into 9 different regions. And so they don't butt up all the way against each other, but that's okay based on the texture that I created. So if we go out here and we open the texture I created, it's all those blades that I've just plopped in here. So we have 9 tiles. So the UVs are definitely going to grab a region of each of these. The only thing to point out is that I only did 5 scans. So there's actually only 5 different leaves in here. So I'm repeating this one twice, and I'm repeating this one twice, and this one twice. So we're going to have, you know, out of the 9, 4 of them aren't going to have any browning at the tip. So you could easily adjust the way these tiles are organized so that you could say like, well, I only want, you know, 50% of them to have browning. So that would mean it's 9 tiles. So maybe you have, you know, 5 of them are all green and 4 of them have some browning at the tip. That's based on the look that you're going for. But this is the texture we're going to use. And so going back into Photoshop, or rather into Maya, all I need to do at this point is go to Hypershade and assign our grass shader to our grass, which is the sky. So I'm going to assign it. So if I did a render right now, they're all going to get the same leaf texture. But the thing is, the way the UVs are structured, they're going to just use a different region of a single image, which in the end is still going to give you some variety across the leaves, even if you don't tile it. And so if, for example, you can see what I'm talking about, if you have something like this is all green, then, you know, one's going to use that region, one's going to use that, one's going to use that, and so forth. So let's do a render test just so you can see what that'll look like. So let's take our camera and we can stay a little bit further. Let's say like that. And I'm going to save my scene. And let's see, so we got that. That's all hidden. We've got our geometry, our light in there. We assigned the shader. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the render view window. All right. And let's do a render. And I'll just pause for a sec. And this is still rendering, and actually I think just to make it easier to see the variety in here, I'm just going to get back to this kind of close camera angle. And if I look at the render that was before it and see where the lighting's coming from, okay. So just so if we're closer, it's easier to see that they're not all the same texture. And render. And pause. Okay. So you can see if you look at the individual blades of grass now that there is variety. So, but the thing is that it's kind of, you know, pulling out chunks of a single texture, so you might get things that, you know, are a little random, less under your control, and, you know, the fact that this is sort of getting a split down the middle of half and half, which might look a little funny. So that's why, based on the UVs we did, it's better to use something tiled, but just showing that right off the bat we're getting a little variety. So, and I'm not crazy about the lighting we're using for this one, so let's maybe adjust the light position on this a little bit. We'll try that. And then we're going to swap our textures. So let's go to Hypershade. And let me graph this. And then also I have all these shaders that have been created by our script as well as Paint Effects. So I can go and delete unused inside here. And then on the file texture, I'm just going to go and grab, and here, let me go to my maps and my leaf scans, and not ivy. Let's go to grass, and I'm going to grab this tile. Okay, and if you wanted to update the swatch, just right click and say refresh swatch. So now that's brought in. Also under effects, my filter is lowered so the texture doesn't get super blurred. And then there you go. We'll want to do another render. But important to point out now is that our UVs are in 9 different tiles, but our bump map isn't. And so that's something that would need to be adjusted. And so if you think about how the UVs are structured, the fact that they're going up and down like this is perfectly fine. It's just if we want 4 of them for a single leaf, and we now have 3 leaves going across in our UVs, we'd want this to be repeated 12 times. So I'm going to put the repeats to 12. And so this is now going to give us the same look going across all the different leaves that you have inside your UV arrangement. So with that, let's do another render. All right, so launch this. And I stopped the render just because I noticed now that the UV region is smaller, the bump depth is too high on these. So you can see we are getting the variety, which is good, but I'm just going to real quick go to Hypershade and go and graph my shader and go to the bump depth and lower this down. And so let's just go and lower that to 0.1 as a test. I'm going to go to render view and let's grab a region where it was obvious. I'm just going to render that region so I can decide on the bump depth that I might want. And that's still a little strong. So technically, you would want to take 0.25, which is what we liked, and divide it by 4, which would be, roughly 0.05, 0.06. And I will launch another full render. Okay, so now you can see that we're getting the variety in our texture. Now, clearly what we're getting is now less grass-like just because the texture that I'm using is, if we go back through our renders, really when we were dealing with, this kind of look, it felt more like grass. This is just an issue of color. And so that's easy to change in our texture to adjust the hue or the value. So the main thing right now was this just to show how to deal with grass and having variety. So we're going to sort of get back to more of a grassy kind of look. But there you go. We have the variety. So we just don't have a variety in length. And so what I'm going to want to do, and let me just put a key on my camera to save that camera view, is now we're going to want to create a couple more strokes that have different length. And so this is the last stroke we created, which had the length at 0.5, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And so we're going to create another one now. We remember the length min was 0.1. And so let's go in here and let's go to the Paint Effects tool. Let's get settings from selected stroke. Go to the Paint Effects tool. And I can go and draw another one in here. And let me go to the template brush settings. And, well, actually for now, we'll leave that alone. Let's just go and draw a little bit of grass inside here. And then go to the attribute editor. Put the sample density to 0.25. And then I'm going to go to the brush length. We can make this one the short one, 0.1 to 0.1. So you can see those are really, really short. And with that, I want to make some adjustments to, the way that it's looking. And so I can go and make some adjustments to the, elevation, minimum and maximum. And then I could go under behavior and adjust the path follow and the gravity. And then, you can look in and decide, well, these are twisting a lot. So I can go and adjust that. All right, just paused for a second because with all the attributes in here, sometimes you have to remember which is the one that controls what. It's the twist rate underneath twist. And so I can go and lower that down just because they're a little bit shorter, so maybe a little bit twist. And then you can also make some decisions as to, it probably doesn't need so many segments since they're shorter. So if I lower that down to just 3, so they're not going to be so heavy. Then inside here, you can also make a decision for the growth under branches. You can see the start branches is at 3. And so you can see if I adjust that, it's creating clumping. So, you don't necessarily, need to care so much about the clumping with this, since you're sort of creating individual strokes. So unless you decide that you do want to have a little bit of it. So let's say if we put that down, number of branches is at 2. So that's actually fine. And let me just zoom out a little bit, see what this short grass is looking like. So now that I lower the segments down, I think I could go down here and add a little bit more path follow to them. Just a little bit more bend. All right. So if I'm happy with that for my really, really short grass, then we'll leave that alone. And then go and create another stroke. And before you convert all this stuff to polys, it's not a bad idea to go and create, all 4 of your strokes so that you can adjust the settings for all 4 while seeing them all together before going and committing. And so I'm just going to go now and probably do that. So we have this one, which is short. I'm going to get settings from this stroke, go to the Paint Effects tool, draw another one, and maybe adjust where I'm drawing to. And then for this stroke, we're going to make this one longer. And so maybe 0.25. Then we can look in and decide if we're happy with the number of, let's lower the sample density, 0.25. And then maybe mess with path follow on these a little bit. Maybe go and adjust the elevation so they're curving a little. Okay, so that's probably fine for those. And then create one more. And so again, this one was 0.1, this was 0.25. Maybe I'll make another one that's 0.35. So on this guy, I'll lower the sample density, go to the brush, and we're going to want to adjust the size. So length 0.35, 0.35. Maybe increase the number of segments. And since I did that, go and mess with my path follow a little bit. Okay. So we have some variety in length with 4 different brushes. So that now we have something that again has short to long. And cool. So let's now, since we have a denser patch, go ahead and convert these to polys and do a render. So I'm going to select these, output quads, output quads, output quads, and then convert these to poly. So modify, convert, Paint Effects to polygons. So I get these guys. And then now for each of these, I need to separate and recombine. Separate, combine, separate, combine. Okay. And then for each one of these, I want to run my script. So I'm going to go for this guy and select a little closer, one of the leaves and run the script. So I'll do this 3 by 3 again, so we'll use the same shader. So that one finished. Now I can go to this one. And run the script. And then finally this guy. All right, so now those have been run. So all 3 of these we can now assign our shader. So go to Hypershade, select all 3, assign our grass shader, and then also don't forget on the new conversions. So if we go to this one and go to the UV texture editor, so what we had, if we go to the new ones, you'll see this one's fine, but you can see we're getting this sort of thing that the script does sometimes. So we just need to bring these all in. So I'm going to do that real quick. Okay, so that's done. And now we can do another render. And sometimes if things turn black on you with MIA materials, when you're adjusting UVs, just be aware that you can go and select it, go to the UV texture editor, and tell it which texture to be thinking about. So if I say ramp, then you can see it's not going to be black anymore. So I can go to these, and these are all now knowing which texture to be referred to. And I can obviously adjust the UVs a little bit if I want. And now we can do another render. So this was with a single length. Now we're doing a render with 4 different lengths and with 9 different textures. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so here's our render, and I did some other ones as well. So we're getting the variety, which is awesome. And so we have now both long and short grass. We have 9 different textures being used. But clearly it was feeling a little less grass-like because the scans that I did and the texture that resulted were from a different kind of plant, not from grass. And so what I did is I went into Photoshop and just simply color corrected the image. So if I go and open the original one that we used in our render, it's this guy. And then I went in and just color corrected it. So I basically just simply used the HSV tool just to increase the lightness, adjust the hue, and adjust the saturation. And so since since we'd already done some renders where it felt a lot more like grass, and I knew which texture I had used for that, what I basically went in and did is just grabbed this texture and pasted it in here as a reference, and then on the background in there just went and made an adjustment layer for hue saturation. Adjustment layers are nice because they're non-destructive. And then simply using this as a reference and affecting just the background, I could just go and increase the lightness, adjust the hue, adjust the saturation, just to get it closer to what my initial grass leaf blade texture looked like. And so that's about it. And then turn that off, flatten it, save it out. And so by swapping to this texture with really the same thing, just different colors, and then doing a render, you can see it becomes a lot more grass-like. And so then just trying a different light direction, and then pulling out a little bit just to do a render. So we're now getting something that has good variety. Maybe there's too much yellowing at the tips on these, so that's something where I could easily go and adjust my 3 by 3 grid, so that instead of having, 5 of them have yellowing at the tip, maybe only 2 of them do, just to get that scattered in there a little differently. So that covers a lot of important information about getting started with grass. And so how to deal with the shader, how to deal with the fact that if you want to use this script to adjust variety on texture, that you're going to want to just sort of split it into different groups with different lengths that are uniform on each group. So now what we're going to get into is covering larger areas with grass as opposed to making a little patch, so that if you did have a terrain or something and you wanted to cover it, how that would be approached. There's a couple techniques that we're going to use to do that. And then obviously in here, now that we have discussed that you can have different types of grass on top of each other, if you wanted to create something where there was a smaller percentage of tall blades to shorter blades, it would be easy to do, meaning that we could go and have much more density on the shorter blades, but have the sample density on the stroke that has the larger blades be higher, lower, or whatever you're trying to achieve. So there's a lot of flexibility thanks to Paint Effects and being able to design the look of the grass. And if we went in and created strokes and kept them active in a scene, it can become again source material for a library to grab the settings and apply to a different scene. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at how to initially just look at the flexibility we could use with strokes on top of each other, covering a large area, let's say a large flat area, and then how to get into areas that are not flat, more curved and larger, and needing a much higher quantity of grass, so that you start getting into the millions of polygons. But we'll pause for a sec and then get into more grass stuff. But I'm just going to go, and here we're getting back to the stuff we did with plants. But obviously with this scene that we started populating with ivy and some different plants, we'll eventually get in here and start putting some grass in it. But for now, we can see our initial grass, all the same texture, which still looks good, just looks like very, healthy grass. And then as we start moving through all the different things we discussed, we get into something where we just have, a little bit of color variation. So I'm going to save my scene, and we'll move on.